Hey, Elisa, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. You celebrated Easter. Hope you had a great Easter. Celebrating Passover. Hopefully, Passover is going great for you. I know it's kind of weird if we can't be with our families, but hopefully, you're making the best of it. So happy. Joke of the day. So, there was a poker player. He lost his arm in a nasty accident, so he had to have a prosthetic arm. Problem was, he just can't deal with it. Yes. All right. So today we're starting the 1960s. So you know what that means. Mama, welcome to the 60s. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, Mama, welcome to the 60s. You knew I had to do it. You were thinking it anyway. All right. So today we'll start the 1960s. Look at the election of 1960. Got some fun videos for you. Really neat do now talking about Leslie Gore. Love Leslie Gore. She's from around here, and she was your age when she was making that music. So there's that. There's no additional homework tonight, but do remember you have that paper on the National Endowment for the Arts, which is due in 2 weeks. So there. The other thing to remember is that the quarter ends the end of this week. So if there are things you need to get to me, get them to me before Friday so I can get the grades in, that type of thing. Other than that, welcome back. Yeah. All right, guys. Talk to you later. Have a good day. So the turbulent 1960s. So today now we'll begin talking about our conversation of the 1960s, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit with the Civil Rights Movement. So remember, that stuff is happening at the same time that these things are happening. So the 1960s is going to be a decade where you're going to see political problems, military problems, social problems. But to begin our conversation, the 1960s, you need to look at the election of 1960, which will see Vice President Richard Nixon taking on Senator John F. Kennedy, and he's a senator from Massachusetts. This was a very close election. Should not have been a close election. Kennedy probably should have won this thing pretty handily. You have that political situation where when you have 2 terms of one party in power, oftentimes the other party wins that election, right? We just saw that in our own politics with the election we had just 4 years ago, right? When you had 2 terms of Obama, 2 terms of a Democrat, and then the Republicans usually went after that. That's kind of the cycle. So that's an uphill battle for Richard Nixon. The economy wasn't doing great in 1960. That's also a problem for Richard Nixon. You had civil strife as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. That's also a problem for Richard Nixon. And then you also had the incumbent, Dwight Eisenhower, didn't embrace Nixon, didn't come out and endorse him, didn't put his arm around him. That also should have hurt Richard Nixon. The stumbling block for Kennedy, what made this really, really close, was that Kennedy was seen as someone who was inexperienced. He was young. And in addition, he was Catholic. And that was a problem. We had never had a Catholic president. And we talked about this in the 1920s with Al Smith. All those problems reemerged for Kennedy. So in a very close election, people look for things that are going to turn it either way. And what most historians look at and point to is the first presidential televised debate between Nixon and Kennedy. And again, it's a type of thing where if you watched it on TV, you thought one candidate won. If you listened to it on the radio, you thought another candidate won. Kennedy just came across better on television. And there's a short video that kind of talks about some of the things he did to do that. So with that, the election of 1960 is actually a very close election, as you can kind of see here, where it's not close electorally, but popular vote-wise, it's actually very, very close. So Kennedy wins the election of 1960. He is the youngest person ever elected to the presidency. In his inaugural, he famously states that ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. and he becomes this dynamic figure. He is the youngest person replacing the oldest person ever to be president. And his story is fascinating. So I've included a little video from actually the Kennedy Foundation, which is narrated by Kennedy family members, giving you a little bit of sense of who he was and whatnot. But he's a man with a fascinating story. He was a war hero, served in World War II, and he was a pilot of a ship, captain of a ship, a PT boat. And a PT boat is a small little craft with usually, anywhere between a 5 to 6 person crew. And while he was on this PT boat, PT 109, it was actually rammed by a Japanese freighter, cut in half. His crew was thrown into the water. And Kennedy, who had a degenerative back issue, and there's another reading I've included for you that talks about Kennedy's various health issues, and it's amazing what he overcame in his life. Swam through open water, rescuing his fellow crewmates and taking them to a deserted island. From that deserted island, he then swims to another island, makes contacts with Aboriginal people in northern Australia. Those Aboriginal people then contact the British Navy. The British Navy then contacts the Americans, and the Americans then rescue Kennedy and his crew. It's an amazing story. They turned it into a movie called PT 109. It's not a great movie. Should be better. It's a better story. But you have that. Kennedy is also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, in which he outlines key moments from the U.S. Senate in which senators cast votes that were politically unpopular, but were the right thing to do at the time. So he's a fascinating, fascinating figure. When he comes in, though, he inherits major problems with Cuba. Fidel Castro has just taken over leadership in Cuba. He did so basically during the year of the election in 1960. And the U.S. government didn't quite know what to do with him. He basically was a nationalist. He was not a communist when he starts. And so the U.S. meets with him, believes that they can actually work with this guy. But what he does is he runs for, he's replacing a leader who is a benevolent dictator. He was a leader that Americans loved since he was favorable to the United States and U.S. business interests in Cuba, but the Cuban people did not like. So Castro kind of is the opposite. He nationalizes businesses, so he takes over companies. So you have Exxon, which is an American company that has oil refineries in Cuba. He takes them over and makes them part of Cuba, the Cuban government. The United States retaliates by basically saying we're not going to buy Cuban products. Cuba then retaliates by saying, all right, I need to make money somehow. So they nationalize the banks. So again, American companies are losing on that. And eventually the U.S. response to this is a blockade in which we basically say we're basically tell nobody to buy any products, from Cuba. Cuba's response is to push closer then to the Soviet Union. So if the United States is not going to be our friend, maybe we'll go to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union then says to Castro, all this can be yours if you make Cuba a communist government. Castro then announces that he is a communist, and what we now have in the age of containment is a brand new communist country within eyesight of Key West. So that is a massive problem. Kennedy's solution is something called the Bay of Pigs, which he inherits from Eisenhower. The Eisenhower administration had come up with a plan to use Cuban exiles to invade Cuba, create a revolution, overthrow Castro. Kennedy then puts that plan into action half-heartedly. The rebellion never happens. Castro easily puts down this invasion, and it makes Kennedy, again, a young president, look weak and naive. The Soviets then look to take advantage of that. The Soviet leader who you see there is Nikita Khrushchev. What Khrushchev does is he makes Berlin the focal point. And what he does is he begins construction of the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. Again, thinking that Kennedy is weak and we'll just kind of roll over on this. Um, and this will lead into a massive confrontation with the Soviet Union, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we can talk more about that next class.